This lesson is on the diadochoi and the Hellenistic age. The diadochoi are the successors of Alexander the Great. That's what that term means. Hellenistic age as a whole runs from 322 to 31 BC, and this includes the history of Greece and Macedon as mostly dominating the political scene in the Mediterranean, at least the far eastern Mediterranean. And the Roman Revolution also occurs during this time, which is a whole other topic, but it overlaps a little bit with the rule of Macedon and the fate of Greece. So the successors are the diadochoi, and we start out after the death of Alexander the Great with Alexander the Fourth on the throne, who is a little boy. He can't rule. And Philip the Third, Philip Aridaeus, he was originally called Aridaeus, but when he ascended to the throne, he was called Philip the Third or Philip Aridaeus. Perhaps he was incompetent or incapacitated because Olympias, should have an S after that, Alexander's mother, poisoned him. We don't know for certain whether Olympias poisoned him, but he was not able to rule. He was mentally incompetent. These are the potential heirs to Alexander the Great, a little baby and Philip III, but neither of them at this point can rule, and Philip will never be able to rule. They are eventually eliminated. They will basically disappear. They will not be factored into the final outcome here, but for a long time they're placed on the throne and used kind of as pawns. In the end, the outcome will be about four main splits. The Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. Ptolemy is a general of Alexander the Great. The Seleucidae in the Levant to India. I'll show you the map on the next page. In Macedon and Greece, it includes Athens, Sparta, and Corinth, although they often remain some degree of independence. The Antigonids will rule. That dynasty takes shape in the course of the next 200 years or so. And finally, in Asia Minor, the last major dynasty to develop in the struggle throughout this Hellenistic age between the successors of Alexander the Great is the Attalids in Pergamum. So four main dynasties. You'll see that along the way there are a number of other contenders and small kingdoms and minor players, but in the end the struggle amounts to about four major dynasties. And this map gives you the idea of where those dynasties are located. You have, first of all, Macedon is up here, and Greece, and then you have the Seleucids go all the way to India, really, in the beginning, although that quickly fades away, and they only end up really in kind of a heartland around right here. This is the Seleucid dynasty that develops. The Ptolemies are in Egypt, and they're very stable. Pergamum is just this one little city-state right here. And again, Macedon and Greece emerges as its own, one of the four major kingdoms. So there's one in Greece and Macedon, two down in Egypt, three over here, and the fourth to emerge and be kind of stable is this little city-state right here on the coast of Asia Minor, Pergamum. Gives you some idea of what those dynasties are. Now, these successors for Alexander the Great's kingdom fight with each other foolishly for 200, 300 years almost, until Rome finally comes along and picks them off one by one. Macedon and Greece are taken over, starting in 168, Macedon in particular in 168. Pergamum, that little city-state right there, is given in the will of the last king to Rome in 133 BC. That's also the date that you'll see where we start the Roman Revolution. The Seleucid dynasty is taken over in 64 BC by Pompey the Great, another player you'll see is very important in the Roman Revolution. And the Ptolemies in Egypt is taken over in the course of 31 to 30 BC. And that final act for Egypt is undertaken by Cleopatra VII. She has two husband brothers along the way, and she has a child with Julius Caesar, who gives the son the name Caesarion, Little Caesar. It means something like that. And other important people in the Roman Revolution include Mark Antony, who eventually is living with and has children with Cleopatra himself, and finally Augustus, who takes over Egypt in 30 BC. After that point, it's relevant to note that you have this kind of Augustan age. You might even mark it earlier from 43 BC to AD 17, somewhere in there. Doesn't matter now for this point in the course. But after Augustus takes over Egypt and kind of ends the Roman Revolution around 31 BC or 30 BC, he becomes Augustus in the year 27 and dominates the age for a whole generation. The end of the Roman Revolution, which starts in 133, is 31 BC when Augustus is victorious at the Battle of Actium over Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Mark Antony is a Roman. Cleopatra is a Greek who's ruling Egypt at the time. And then his dynasty that's founded, Augustus, is 27 BC to AD 68. That's the Julio-Claudian emperors. They call themselves princeps, which really is where the word prince comes from, which means first among equals. But really, they've become the kings of this of Rome again, and they've absorbed at this point all of the diadochoi successor kingdoms of Alexander the Great's former empire. The Hellenistic age then spans 3 centuries, 323 to 31 BC. There's 3 main sources of history of this time, primary sources, but all 3 have been lost. Diodorus was the last one. He was lost around 1453, AD 1453. But we have a lot of Egyptian papyrus, record of daily lives, letters, wills, marriage contracts, leases, financial documents, school texts, government actions, tax collection records, religious affairs, legal proceedings. So we can, with these primary sources of daily life, we can reconstruct a great deal of that society. We've lost the kind of historical outlines that were written, the literary history writings, but not the kind of more important day-to-day proceedings that we can find in these sources. For at least the first half century, there's conflict between the diadochoi. About 280, the first wave of these successors they're all dead. And then after that, 3 main dynasties emerge. The Ptolemies in Egypt, as I mentioned, the Seleucids in Western Asia, the Antigonids in Macedon and Northern Greece, and then finally the 4th kingdom that in Pergamum emerges. But they still have conflict with one another, and they're still always vying for power and waging war on one another. But these cultures, this Hellenistic culture as it's called, lasts for at least 2 centuries, and it even dominates really what goes on in the Middle Ages. And this Hellenistic culture and Greek culture in general is adopted by the Romans. So although they have this 300-year or 200-year period of dominance and stability, they're constantly fighting with each other. Nonetheless, their culture survives, even though their kingdoms don't. The details start like this. Round 1, you might call this, is the death of Perdiccas. So Perdiccas is the main person in charge after Alexander dies. He oversees the regency of Philip Aridaeus, Philip III, and the baby Alexander IV with a man named Antipater. And they pretend that they're not seeking power for themselves. Maybe they're really not, but it seems in the end that all of these figures will vie with one another for supremacy. There are some, they divide up the kingdom to some extent as far as their influence. Ptolemy, a general at this point, goes to Egypt. An area in northern Greece called Thrace goes to Lysimachus. And western Anatolia, which is modern Turkey, and later most of Turkey, go to a man named Antigonus the One-Eyed. And they're not ruling it solely. They're not kings of these areas. You have Philip Aridaeus and Alexander IV as the kings. You have Antipater kind of overseeing that, and then these figures dominating certain regions of this conquest of Alexander the Great. And there are a total of about 23 satrapies that were established in the Persian Empire that Alexander's successors are now ruling. And so most of these former satrapies are still held by the governors that were in place, the satraps that were in place, but they will quickly fade in importance for these major players people like Ptolemy, Eumenes will struggle, Lysimachus will struggle, Antipater will continue to assert his dominance. And again, in theory, Philip Aridaeus and Alexander IV are the kings in name. So we can look at this map again, and you get an idea of where these regions are. You have the area that's more or less assigned to Ptolemy, which is Egypt. Here's what I'm talking about when I talk about Anatolia. Here's the Levant and the area that used to be the heart of the Persian Empire right there. That's where Seleucus will eventually dominate, although right now that's not the case. And then Macedon is this kingdom up in the north. Thrace is this area right here that I mentioned. Now it's modern Greece. It's not, in fact, that's out of the borders of modern Greece, I should say. And down here is the heartland where Sparta and Athens are, of Greece. What happens early on in this process when the two kings, Philip Aridaeus, Philip III, and Alexander IV, the baby, are on the throne, is that there's a revolt among Greek settlers in Bactria. So Bactria is in the far east. That's an area that does not stay long under the dominance of the Macedonian kingdom, close to Afghanistan, close to India. Bactria, the Greek settlers there, about 23,000 of them start to march home to Macedon. Perdiccas forces them to return, but the European Greeks, the Greeks in Athens, Sparta, Thebes, Corinth, mainland Greece today, modern Greece even, what you could call it, revolt immediately upon hearing the news that Alexander is dead. And you'll see that this is the same old, same old. The Greeks want their freedom, and they're never really going to get it. Athens, for example, once these Bactrians start to march home, once they find out Alexander's dead, Athens mobilizes its largest force since the Peloponnesian War. They besiege Antipater. I've highlighted his name, so there's a lot of names to keep track of, but Antipater is a crucial one. They besiege Antipater in this city of Lamia, and you have this short-lived Lamian War. But it's a pretty big deal because right now Alexander's empire is not really functional or strong. You have these successors loosely in place, but nonetheless Antipater and his allies decisively defeat Athens, both in a naval battle and in a land battle by 322, and Athens' stand against being dominated by Macedon is pretty much over right there. Antipater also dissolves the Corinthian League. This was an alliance centered at Corinth, another strong city at this point, but this is the last vestige, the last traces that the Greeks were actually free partners rather than subjects of Macedon. The Greeks will continue often to be fooled into believing that they're partners with Macedon, but the truth is they've been conquered by Macedon and they're under their rule, even if Macedon doesn't always show it. And this is the period in which the democracy in Athens is really dismantled. It's been a problem for Athens almost from the beginning, if you remember the Peloponnesian War, and Macedon just dismantles it. Demosthenes, a famous rhetorician that stood up and arguably started the war with Philip II, Alexander's father, commits suicide forced by Antipater to do so, and other Athenian leaders are executed. And then Athens is ruled by an oligarchy, kind of a puppet government installed just like after the Peloponnesian War, and they were managed by a garrison left in the city of Macedonians. The great Athenian general Phocion opposed this war, but he was eventually put to death in 318 for allegedly delivering Athens over to the enemy, to the Macedonians. This is almost certainly slanderous and false. Phocion seemed to be among the greatest Athenians that ever lived, one of the honest politicians, one of the good men that lived in Athens, but just like Socrates, he was executed by the city on trumped-up charges. So at this point what happens is Athens goes under the control of Antipater, and the successors in diadochoi make alliances with one another, which shows that the loose agreement that they've had amongst each other while the baby and the incapacitated Philip Aridaeus rule is already breaking. A man named Perdiccas and Eumenes ally with one another, and Antipater, Craterus, Antigonus, who will continue to be very important and found his dynasty, and Lysimachus, who has a long run of influence and power, they ally with another. So there's basically two teams now, Perdiccas and Eumenes, and Antipater, Craterus, Antigonus, and Lysimachus. So these four versus these two, and that's the first major break that we have, the first obvious break among the successors of Alexander the Great. Ptolemy, in the meanwhile, takes Alexander's corpse. He steals Alexander's corpse and heads off to Egypt. A strange move, but I guess he thinks that the corpse will give him some extra legitimacy. Perdiccas doesn't like this, for example, in particular. Perdiccas is up here. Even less than he likes Antipater, Craterus, Antigonus, along with Lysimachus, and so he attacks Egypt. Now we have actual battles breaking out among these successors in 321. So Perdiccas, who's allied himself with Eumenes, in particular, does not like the move by Ptolemy to take the body of Alexander, and he attacks Egypt in 321. And Perdiccas then left Eumenes to fight Antipater and his allies. So again, the two teams are Perdiccas and Eumenes. Perdiccas goes off to fight Ptolemy, and then Eumenes is left to deal with Antipater, Craterus, Antigonus, and Lysimachus. What happens next is that Ptolemy maybe bribed Perdiccas' troops who attack him in Egypt, and they assassinate Perdiccas. Among the assassins is a very important man named Seleucus, who will go on to found one of the longest-lasting dynasties among the successors. Just so you keep track in the long term is really important. The really important figures in the long term are Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, and not for the very, very long term, but for the immediate future, Antipater is important. Antigonus, Ptolemy, Seleucus are the really key players in the long term, and right now Antipater is particularly important. So at the same time that Perdiccas was assassinated, probably because of Ptolemy's bribery, and among the assassins is Seleucus, at the same time that this is happening, Eumenes defeats Antipater. That's the team up here, Antipater, Craterus, Antigonus, and Lysimachus. Eumenes, even though his ally Perdiccas has been assassinated, he defeats Antipater, and an important player at this time, Craterus, is killed. And then what happens next is Antipater replaces Perdiccas as the head of the regency, overseeing the baby, Alexander IV, and Philip Aridaeus. So Antipater, in the midst of all this fighting and confusion, takes control, and the assassination of Perdiccas, it allows Antipater to take control of the regency and oversee the two puppet kings. So the outcome of all this alliance making right here and fighting, the attack on Egypt, the assassination of Perdiccas, is that Antipater effectively seizes power. He meets with the other major players in Triparadesius in Syria in July of 320. Ptolemy gets to be governor of Egypt. He keeps his satrapy. Lysimachus keeps his satrapy, his governorship. Seleucus, who's the assassin of Perdiccas, gets Babylon as his satrap, as his area to rule. Eumenes is condemned to death. Eumenes, remember, was Perdiccas' ally, and Perdiccas has been assassinated by Ptolemy and Seleucus. And Antigonus the One-Eyed, he lost his eye in battle, is given the task to assassinate Eumenes. And Antigonus is given control of Asia, whatever that exactly means. Antipater then returns to Macedon with the two kings, and he's going to really rule Macedon and be at the center of this with the other players like Antigonus, Eumenes, Seleucus, and Ptolemy as his underlings, his subordinates, but that won't last for long. So there's two kings, neither of whom can actually rule, Philip Aridaeus and Alexander IV, the baby. Antipater's overseeing these two, and the other generals of Alexander and other influential players are ruling their little provinces or satraps. Now Antigonus the One-Eyed is tasked with hunting down Eumenes, but in many ways Antigonus emerges even more powerful than Antipater because he's got the troops. He's the general of all the necessary troops and resources he needs to hunt down Eumenes, and you'll see that Antigonus uses his position to gain and gain and gain in power and influence. So that's the first phase. This is where the successors kind of break down, start fighting each other, make alliances amongst each other, and who emerges as powerful is Ptolemy in Egypt, Seleucus, who helped assassinate Perdiccas, Antigonus the One-Eyed, and Antipater. Antipater won't last for the long term, but Antigonus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy will. In fact, they'll found dynasties that last hundreds of years.